Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Mullen, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, RDA 101, How to Make the Move, sponsored by Rowman & Littlefield and featuring former principal cataloger at UCLA, Sara Layne. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will also see a Q&A panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We will spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please feel free to submit them throughout. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. And now for our presenters. Sara Layne was a librarian at UCLA until her retirement in 2013. She worked as a librarian at UCLA for almost 30 years, serving most recently as principal cataloger in the Cataloging and Metadata Center. She has been active in the American Library Association, at one point chairing the Cataloging and Classification section of AL. She has published in several areas, but primarily in the area of access to images, and co-authored Improving Online Public Access Catalogs with Martha Yee. She currently serves on the editorial board of Cataloging and Classification Quarterly. We will also be joined by Charles Harmon, who serves as executive editor at Rowman & Littlefield. Charles will be helping with our Q&A, as well as sharing some information about a few publications later during today's program. But for now, we are ready to get the presentation started. So take it away, Sara.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome to RDA 101, a webinar for catalogers making the move to RDA. Before I begin this presentation, some acknowledgments. Shamia Pompey Kinsey, who wrote most of the book, Making the Move to RDA, the book that I am using as the basis of this webinar. Shamia taught me a lot about RDA. After Shamia's untimely passing last summer at the age of 37, I finished her book with the assistance of 3 colleagues. Luis Menges, John Reamer, and Hermina Vermey. I could not have finished it without them. Finally, I take responsibility for any errors that you may find in the book. Please credit Shamia with all the good parts. What will this webinar do for you? A 1-hour webinar cannot teach you everything you need to know about RDA. My goal today is to introduce you to RDA and to prepare you for learning to catalog using RDA in the MARC environment. I will tell you a little about how RDA came to be, identify some major differences between RDA and our previous cataloging code, AACR2, and then I'll walk you through an RDA bibliographic record and an RDA authority record encoded in the MARC format. Let's start with some assumptions. Do you know anything about RDA? I am assuming that the answer is not really. Although you may have heard of RDA, you know very little about it. If you do know something about it, then this webinar may not give you much, if any, new information. Do you have some knowledge of AACR2? I am assuming that you do have some knowledge of AACR2, the cataloging rules that we have used for the last 30 years. Are you familiar with the MARC format? Yes, I am assuming that you have some familiarity with the MARC format. So, what is RDA? RDA is Resource Description and Access. It's a cataloging standard implemented rather widely last year. It's available by subscription as part of the online product, the RDA Toolkit. It's also available for purchase as a loose-leaf publication. Changes are made to RDA on a fairly regular basis, and these changes are incorporated relatively quickly into the online product. They may be incorporated somewhat less quickly into the print. So, how did RDA come to be? RDA was originally envisioned as AACR3, essentially a revision of AACR2. As work progressed on the revision, though, a variety of factors led to a change in direction. These factors included the rapidly expanding digital environment that we are in, the development of metadata standards outside of our library community, and the publication of FRBR, often known as FRBR, about which I will say a bit more in a minute. As a result of these factors, the direction changed from a revision of the existing code to the development of a new standard, which needed a new name, Resource Description and Access, or RDA. What is FRBR? And what do you need to know about FRBR in order to understand RDA? FRBR is a publication with the title Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, a report published by IFLA in 1998. The purpose of the report was, as the name implies, to identify what is required or necessary in bibliographic records so that they are functional, so that they are useful. It was not, nor was it intended to be, a cataloging code, although it can serve to inform cataloging codes. The term FRBR is also used for the conceptual model described in the report from IFLA. Functional in the context of FRBR means fulfilling 4 user tasks: find, identify, select, and obtain. In order to fulfill these user tasks, the writers of the FRBR report developed a conceptual model of those entities that are of interest to users of bibliographic data. The entities are organized into 3 groups. Each entity has a set of attributes, and each entity can have relationships with other entities. This entity attribute model strongly influenced the structure of RDA, so a basic understanding of the model helps greatly with navigating and understanding RDA itself. So, what are the FRBR entities? The first group, FRBR Group 1 entities, we see listed on the left of this slide. They are 4, these bibliographic entities: work, expression, manifestation, and item. They are sometimes referred to by the initial letters of the words or as WEMI. And these correspond to 2 sections in RDA, the first 2 sections. Section 1, which is devoted to recording attributes of manifestations and items, and Section 2, which is devoted to expressions of works and their attributes. I want to show you an example here of Group 1 entities showing their hierarchical relationship. The work here, preceded by the little W, is 1984, the novel by George Orwell. You can see in this example, of course this isn't the entire, everything of 1984, but we've picked 2 expressions. One is an original English language text, that's E1, and the second expression is an English spoken word expression. Within each of these expressions, we've listed 2 manifestations. The New American Library's 1977 volume and the World Library 1996 online resource for the English language text. And the 2 audio books for the spoken word expression. So those are manifestations, the ones preceded by M. I've also put in items. An item would be a library copy. It's the copy of the particular copy of the manifestation. Now, one of the things that you can see here is that, say, take any one of these, the BBC audiobooks audio cassette, for example, the first manifestation under the second expression. Well, you'll see there, and in the line that starts E2 and in the line that starts W, in all 3 of those places, you'll see elements that you would normally see in a single bibliographic record in one of our MARC records. That is because we're describing the manifestation in our MARC record, but we're also including information about the expression and the work in that record. And when we get a little later in this presentation, you will see that some of these elements here will make more sense. That, for example, the New American Library is the publisher, and that is a manifestation level element. Group 2 entities are, in FRBR, persons and corporate bodies. Group 2 entities are responsible for Group 1 entities. Remember the slide of 1984? Just move back to it briefly. There you saw under the work that it was 1984 by George Orwell. George Orwell is a Group 2 entity, a person that has a relationship with the work. He is the author of 1984. He's responsible for the work. So these Group 2 entities correspond to RDA Section 3, Chapters 8 through 11, which are devoted to the attributes of persons, families, and corporate bodies. Families were added as a Group 2 entity after the initial development of FRBR. FRBR Group 3 entities are subjects, concepts, objects, events, and places. These correspond to RDA Section 4. Now, the interesting thing about Section 4 is that most of it hasn't been written yet. The one chapter that does exist of the chapters 12 to 16 that are there, for which there are placeholders, is Chapter 16, Identifying Places. That one does exist. Finally, relationships. Relationships are very important in FRBR and in RDA. As you can see, RDA devotes 6 sections, totaling 21 chapters, to recording relationships. In addition, there are relationship designators listed in the appendices to RDA. All of these FRBR entities can be related to each other in various ways, both within a single group of entities and between entities from different groups. I've just pulled out a few examples here. There are many, many. For example, an expression can be a translation of a work. That is a relationship between 2 entities within Group 1. Or you could have a relationship between a Group 2 entity and a Group 1 entity. A person is a Group 2 entity, and that person can be the author of a work. The work is the Group 1 entity. Or you can have relationships between 2 Group 2 entities. For example, one corporate body can be the successor to another corporate body. We don't have time today to explore thoroughly the potential of FRBR, but very quickly, FRBR helps us by giving us a way to conceptualize bibliographic records and data, also user tasks. And it can provide a conceptual foundation for cataloging standards and systems, as it has in the case of RDA. The basic goal is to improve access to and navigation through our data. So that is how RDA came to be. Now for a small quiz before we go on to the major differences between RDA and AACR2. FRBR is a cataloging code. true or false? Well, splendid. This is false. It is a conceptual model. It can and has informed the development of cataloging standards and systems. Next question. FRBR entities influenced the structure of RDA. True or false? True. RDA is structured based on FRBR entities and attributes and the relationships among them. So, next section. Major differences between RDA and AACR2. What are these? First, there are some conceptual differences. AACR2 consisted of rules. RDA consists of instructions. Instructions are considered less prescriptive than rules. Options. There are lots of options in RDA. And this means that catalogers have more options to choose among, and it means there are more opportunities for cataloger judgment to be exercised. Core elements. RDA specifies approximately a dozen core elements. That is, elements that always should be present in a description to meet the basic needs of users. Title proper, for example, is a core element. AACR2 had levels of description, 3 different levels of description. Display. Rules for display, including punctuation between elements, are not included in the body of RDA. An RDA appendix does give instructions for incorporating ISBD punctuation and ordering of data elements. ISBD is the International Standard for Bibliographic Description. AACR2, on the other hand, incorporated instructions for ordering of elements and for punctuation into the rules themselves. They were right there as part of the rules. With RDA, display is no longer considered an integral part of describing and providing access. This absence of absolute instructions for display, as well as the increased number of options, gives us a lot of freedom. But as with freedom in some other contexts, it increases our responsibility as catalogers. Structure. I've shown you the basic structure of RDA, and it is clearly different from AACR2, especially in sections 1 to 2, which are organized based on FRBR Group 1 entities, rather than the format-based organization that was in AACR2, books, cartographic materials, manuscripts, music, etc. Also, within those chapters, those format-based chapters in AACR2, the rules were based on ISBD areas of description. So instructions for display are in an appendix. And there is, however, some good news for those of us who know AACR2, and that is that many of the AACR2 rules are actually present in RDA. They are just rearranged or relocated. Terminology. There is an effort in RDA to move away from what is regarded as card catalog terminology. I've put 3 examples here. A heading in AACR2 is an access point in RDA. A uniform title in AACR2 is a preferred title in RDA. AACR2's main entry becomes the authorized access point for the work. The old concepts are generally present, but under new names. There's increased granularity in RDA, a more precise specifying of types of data, and this has led to the establishment of new MARC fields and subfields. I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 examples listed here. The first one is RDA content, media, and carrier, which are replacing the AACR2 General Material Designation, or GMD. The second is publication, distribution, etc. information. And then the third is authority data. The AACR2 GMD problem. Although AACR2 did include a GMD for every format, for some formats, notably books and other printed materials, it was seldom used, at least by catalogers in the US. More common has been the use of the GMD for non-book resources. For example, video recording, electronic resource. But what happened when you have a streaming video, which is a video recording that is also an electronic resource? Just one of the two GMDs could be used. RDA replaced the GMD with three separate data elements: content type, media type, and carrier type. And new MARC fields and subfields were developed for these data elements. The 336 is for content, the 337 for media, and the 338 for carrier. Using these RDA elements, a record for a streaming video would have the following: a 336 field for content type two-dimensional moving image. The subfield 2, by the way, indicates the vocabulary list from which the terms are taken. So the RDA content list supplied the two-dimensional moving image description. The 337 field is media type, in this case, computer. The 338 is the carrier type, in this case, online resource. Note that RDA is silent on just where and how these data elements should display. And different systems and those responsible for system configuration have made a variety of choices in how and where to display these. Publication, distribution, etc., which is an RDA sort of term. Instead of the AACR2 publication, distribution, etc. area, a single area, RDA has 5 separate data elements: production, publication, distribution, manufacture, and copyright. In AACR2, we used the 260 field and put all this information in that one field. In RDA, we have the 264 field, which has a second indicator that can show which type of data element is being recorded. For example, we see here the way this information would have looked in AACR2 with the publication information and the distribution information all included in one 260 field. In RDA, this data is more precisely identified. The first 264 field is the publication information identified by the first indicator 1. The second 264 is the distribution information identified by the second indicator 2. Note, by the way, that ISBD punctuation is being used here in the RDA examples. But this means that New York as the place of distribution or the place of the distributor is much more easily identified by machines for various purposes than it was in the AACR2 MARC environment. Authority data. The increased granularity has led to the establishment of new MARC fields and subfields for authority data. We'll look at some of these when we look at an authority record in a few minutes, but I've listed some of them here. There are new fields for dates, places, field of activity, occupation, gender, and language. Transcription. There's increased emphasis in RDA on transcribing what is there rather than abbreviating or correcting or even normalizing. For example, take the title and statement of responsibility. If the title is in all caps, RDA provides the option to transcribe it in all caps, or you can normalize it to sentence case. There's no more rule of 3. If you have more than 3 authors, you may omit all but the first, or you may include them all in a statement of responsibility. If author credentials and affiliations are included on the title page, you may transcribe them if you wish to do so. There are fewer abbreviations of transcribed data. If second revised edition, all spelled out, appeared on the title page, under AACR2 we would have abbreviated it and recorded it as second rev ed. In RDA, it would be transcribed as is, second revised edition. Also, corrections are now made in notes rather than being included in the fields where the error occurs or lack of information occurs. Recording data. There are also fewer abbreviations when it comes to recording data. P becomes pages, for example. Latin words have been eliminated or at least reduced. CA period becomes approximately. Et al. Becomes others, and others. If you're omitting, for example, multiple authors from the statement of responsibility, you would say John Jones and 3 others, not John Jones et al. SL becomes place of publication, not identified. Terminology considered arcane has been reduced. For example, FL period becomes active. Recording relationships. RDA, as you saw, there's a lot of instructions about recording relationships. RDA emphasizes the explicit recording of relationships, and the result is greatly increased use of relationship designators. I have 2 examples here. If Charles Dickens is the author of a work, his name appears in a 100 field, just as it would have with AACR2, but the relationship designator author would be added to the field. Or if you were cataloging a work that was an adaptation of a work of Dickens, you would include the relationship designator in the subfield I of the 700 field, adaptation of work. In AACR2, you would have had a note combined with the 700 field, rather existing in the record, and then you would also have had a 700 field, but of course without the subfield I. And relationship designators, once again, are listed in RDA appendices. It's a controlled vocabulary. So I've given you a quick summary of the major differences between AACR2 and RDA. Now for a short quiz before we look at some actual records. Question 1. RDA includes instructions for displaying bibliographic data in OPACs. True or false? Well, you're doing well on this. It's false. RDA includes no instructions for display of data in OPACs, although an appendix includes instructions for ISBD punctuation and ordering of data elements. Next question. Imagine a book with a title page that looks exactly like this, Time for Change, all in caps. Both of the following would be acceptable transcriptions under RDA. A, Time for Change, all caps, and B, Time for Change in sentence case. True or false? Yes, you're right. This is true. Both are acceptable. U.S. practice is currently to follow B, that is, if possible, use sentence case when transcribing titles. Now we'll move on to what does RDA look like in MARC? I will walk you through 2 records, one bibliographic and one authority, which will show you what the application of RDA looks like when it's encoded in the MARC format. Also, I want to mention that available through the RDA toolkit is MARC mapping for RDA elements. First, the bibliographic record. This record is based on a record for a real book, but I have changed it slightly to include more RDA aspects. Following current U.S. practice, ISBD punctuation has been used in this record. And for purposes of this presentation, I have identified the RDA aspects of the record by placing them in bold type. Note that a lot of the record is not in bold. In other words, it is the same as it would have been had the book been cataloged using AACR2. Now I'm going to highlight and discuss 5 different parts of this record. First, identifying an RDA record. You will see that in the leader there is an I that is boxed there, and that tells you that the record uses ISBD punctuation. You will find this in RDA records that use ISBD punctuation, but you may also remember that you will find this I in AACR1 records that used ISBD punctuation. So you'll find it in RDA bib records, but also in old AACR1 records. The thing that really tells you that this is an RDA bibliographic record is the subfield E, RDA, in the 040 field. It's also current U.S. practice to use the subfield B in the 040 to indicate the language of cataloging. Not the language of the data, but the language of cataloging, which in this case is English. Next, we'll look at the 100 field. Here we see the relationship designator author used. The original record on which I based this did not have one, but as policies have developed, U.S. policy is to try to use a relationship designator in every 100 field. Instructions for access points for persons may be found in RDA Chapter 9. That is where you find the instructions for deciding on the preferred name for the person. And in Chapters 19 through 21, that is where the instructions for recording relationships between a person and work, expression, manifestation appear. Again, lists of authorized relationship designators are found in the RDA appendices. Now we'll look at an addition statement. Here we see the unabbreviated addition statement for RDA, and we can compare it with what it would have been under AACR2 rules. Publication, etc. information. Here we have another example of more granularity, where under AACR2, all of this information, the publication information and the copyright date, would have been in a single 260 field. The copyright date would have been identified by putting a small c in front of the 2010. In RDA, we see 2 264 fields. The first one has a second indicator 1 that tells you its publication information. We see a second 264 field with a second indicator 4 that tells you that the field contains copyright information. And there you see the copyright date. This increased granularity and very specific coding can help in machine manipulation analysis of the data. It's very clear under RDA as encoded in MARC what the copyright date is. It's somewhat more difficult, especially for a machine, to identify it in the 260 field. Now for the physical description. I've put physical in quotation marks because that's AACR2 terminology, not RDA terminology. So here we see the 300 field. It looks very similar, except that pages and illustrations are spelled out. But we see also here the RDA content, media, and carrier types for a book. The content type for a book found in the 336 field is text. The media type for a book is unmediated. That appears in the 337 field. A book is unmediated because you do not need any equipment to mediate the access to it. The carrier type is a volume, and that is found in the 338 field. Now, both content type and carrier type, that is text and volume, are core elements in RDA. Media type is not core, so it could be omitted as cataloger's judgment or as national policy dictates. I also want to point out a couple more things here. One is that while in AACR2 all the rules for, say, the 300 field were in one place, in RDA they are divided between two different chapters. That is because extent and dimensions are considered to be attributes of a manifestation. So they're found in Chapter 2, while illustrative content is held to be an attribute of an expression. So the instructions for that are found in Chapter 6. Similarly, with the RDA content media carrier elements, carrier is held to be an attribute of a manifestation, and so the rules for the media and carrier types are found in RDA Chapter 2, but the rule for content type is in Chapter 6. Finally, I want to reiterate that there is a lack of display standards for the 336, 337, 338 fields. What about the remainder of the record? Here we see that almost nothing is different. Volume and pages are spelled out, but everything else could be as it was in AACR2. Remember that RDA does not yet have chapters for subjects. Also, for those of you who are still tracing series are considered a kind of related work. And although you see no relationship designator in the 830 field, that is because the 830 tag itself serves to identify the relationship. Now we'll look at an authority record for a person. This authority record is based on a real authority record, but I have updated it slightly for the purposes of this presentation. Again, as with the bibliographic record, I've used bold to identify the RDA elements of the record. Note that while the 100 field and the 670 fields are basically unchanged from AACR2, there are many new RDA elements in this record. Now I will highlight and discuss three different aspects of this record, emphasizing the new data elements. First, identifying an RDA authority record. The 040, it's the same technique as was used in the bibliographic record. The subfield E, RDA, tells you that this is an RDA record. The subfield B, English, tells you that the language of the cataloging is English. In the 008, byte 10 has a value of Z, and that will be true in RDA records, but not exclusively in RDA records, because what that means, the byte 10 is for descriptive cataloging rules, and it means simply other. So it could be for any other rules, not just RDA. Dates and places. Although the dates could always have been present in the 100 and 670 fields, note how precisely they are expressed and coded in this record. You can see them in the 670 field, the birth date and the death date, but in the 046 field, you see that the subfield F gives you the birth date in the form year, month, date, and subfield G gives you the death date in the form year, month, date. This makes the data much more useful for machine manipulation and analysis. You can now also record in coded, controlled form the places associated with a person. So here we see the place of birth as Alabama in the subfield A, the place of death, New York, subfield B, and the place of activity, the country of activity of the person in the subfield C. And we see in the subfield 2 that these are all controlled vocabulary terms drawn from the name authority file. Another set of new elements and fields for the authority record are the field of activity and occupation, also gender and language. Like the dates and the places associated with the person, this information could have been present in the 670 field of an AACR2 record. But that data in the 670 field was not input using a controlled vocabulary, and it was not coded for machine manipulation. Here we see the field of activity performing arts. We see the occupations of this person listed in this 374 field, actors, singer, dancers, male models, and all of these terms are drawn from LCSH. That is why they are in the plural form. The 375 field contains the gender of the person, and the 377 field, their language. This coding that we've seen in the authority record could enable systems to help users find, for example, the works of actors born in Alabama, or of people active in the performing arts in the United States who were born in the 1930s. So the machine could gather these authority records together for you, and then you could search for the works of a certain category of person. You can see how, I know when I was looking at art history, having, say, being able to look for painters, French painters from the 17th century, or French female painters from the 17th century, something like that, could have been very useful. So this has been a very basic introduction to RDA. We looked at how RDA came to be, at its major differences from AACR2, and also at a couple of RDA records encoded in MARC. If you haven't yet felt comfortable putting your toe in the RDA waters, I hope this presentation will have helped, and that you can now approach learning RDA with some confidence that you can do so, that you can make the move to RDA. So thank you, and there's time for questions. Charles, do we have any questions?
Yes, indeed you do. We have several, and I'll present two at the same time. One person asked, what is GMD? And another person said that their patrons were furious that GMD was eliminated from the catalog in RDA because it's unclear what formats things are on. Is there a way of making that clear?
Well, that's a very good question. GMD, it was general material designation, and it was an AACR2 element, and it appeared immediately after the title proper. So you're right, it was a very early warning of what the format was of a particular thing. The replacement, the content carrier media type, could conceivably serve as a replacement, or they're supposed to be a replacement for the GMD. Display, of course, is completely up to system designers and configurers. Theoretically, if you had the system that would do this, you could have that information display in the same place that it displayed in AACR2 records. You could put it up following the title if your system allowed that. There are also people who believe that these fields should be translated into icons, which should display early in the record. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Okay. Another listener would like to know if it's acceptable to use thesauri other than RDA content, media, and carrier in the 336, 337, and 338 fields.
I think that would depend on where you're cataloging and who you're cataloging for. I believe sort of the U.S. policy as developed by the Library of Congress has been to use the RDA content, etc. lists. However, I know I've seen discussion of using other lists for those purposes. As long as they are identified in the subfield 2, it would seem that that would be possible. It would depend, as I say, on your cataloging agency and your national policies.
Okay, and the same person had another question about those three fields, 336, 337, and 338. How will they be valuable for discovery?
Well, that's also a good question. I imagine, I guess my personal take is that they might be more valuable for filtering than for initial discovery, although they could be used in that way. But I think they were more envisioned as filtering devices, so that once you got, say, a particular work, you would have a choice of whether you wanted to have it in text form or recorded sound form or something like that.
Okay, and now moving to another field, to 264. Do all the elements of 264 go in separate fields?
Do all the elements go in separate fields? Well, if you have everything relating to publication specifically would go in a single 264 field. But then if you had distribution information, that would go in a separate 264 field. If you had manufacture information, like printing information, that would go in yet another 264 field. But within the field, you would have place, the name of the publisher or distributor or whatever, and the date of the publication, distribution, manufacture within a single field.
Okay, and then someone else asked, what is RDA code in leader part?
RDA code in leader part?
That's what the question says.
In a bibliographic record, it's not, there is no code in the leader that is specific to RDA. RDA records will have an I for ISBD in the leader, but that does not necessarily mean RDA. It could mean an earlier code like AACR1 that uses ISBD punctuation. The only way to definitively identify an RDA record is to look at the 040 field, the subfield E.
Okay. Someone else asked, in a series, how does RDA treat book and volume? BK?
Piece. So if it were V period, you would put V period. If it were volume, VOLUME, you would put VOLUME. However, and this I believe is a policy decision, in the access point for the series, current U.S. policy is to continue to normalize or abbreviate those according to standard abbreviations.
Okay. Someone else asked, she says, I'm thinking of OCLC master records. Will they be converted or modified to conform to RDA standards? That seems like too large a task. And will librarians from here forward be adding both AACR2 and RDA records depending on their expertise?
Also good questions. Answering the second part first, there is no cataloging police that makes you use one code over another, so certainly people could continue to use AACR2. As far as OCLC and the master records, there has been discussion, and sorry, I don't remember if there's been a final decision, but there are policy documents posted on the OCLC site. But there was discussion of making certain changes that could be made automatically. For example, adding the 336, 337, 338, the content media carrier type, to all records, whether they are AACR2 or RDA. That would enable more consistent filtering, for example, if all records had those elements. There's also been some discussion of expanding abbreviations so that to make the records more consistent. As far as authority questions, the headings should be consistent with the authority file, and those are being usually there were some automated changes made to the authority file to bring them up to RDA, and there are others that are being done manually, record by record.
Okay, we have a lot more questions than we're going to get to, but one other, which several other people are asking similar things. AACR2 isn't inherently limited to use with the MARC format. Is RDA explicitly meant only for use with MARC?
Oh, good question. No. In fact, RDA was, I believe, designed not for MARC. The people who know the most about it say that actually its full potential will not be realized until we have something other than the MARC format. However, it will work. It is being made to work with the MARC format.
Okay. And then someone else asked the general question, what about fixed fields?
Fixed fields. That's OCLC terminology for the leader and the 008 field. So in the examples where I showed in the bibliographic record the leader, that would be the value I, that would be a fixed field in OCLC. And in the authority record, same thing or similar thing. It would be descriptive rules. I can't remember what the mnemonic is for that fixed field, but the 008 and the leader are the OCLC fixed fields.
Okay, and finally, not a question, but you have about 10 to 15 people from all over the country who have typed in and said, very, very good presentation, and thank you.
Well, thank you.
Several other people have also complimented your slides with the illustration of records.
Thank you.
And if it's okay, I will talk a little bit about people on the call. You can use a code, EMRDA, to take 25% off Sarah's book, Making the Move to RDA, as well as several others. One of them is Managing Digital Audiovisual Resources, a Practical Guide for Librarians, which is one of the books in our new Practical Guide for Librarians series. We also just released this week What Every Library Director Should Know by Library Journal former Librarian of the Year, Sue Curzon. Digital Preservation for Library Archives and Museums, which talks about how to do digital preservation. And finally, here's the cover of Sarah and Shema's book, Making the Move to RDA. And now I'll turn it back over to Laura from ACRL Choice.
Well, it looks like we are ready to wrap up our time together. I'd like to give a virtual round of applause to our presenters for sharing some great information today. We really appreciate your time and your insights. As a reminder, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice that includes instructions on how to access the archived version. Thanks again to all of our participants